Hi, my name is Chris Jordan, and this is the first episode of Blue Collar Philosophy. So, the idea behind this show is to take topics that may be spoken about in more abstract terms and kind of break them down into something that's more easily understandable. But more importantly, what I'm aiming to do with this is to take uh, philosophical concepts, which is a big umbrella, and discuss ways to actually apply it to your life that's helpful. So the first topic is actually non-attachment, and my friend Zach here, he's actually the person who introduced me to this kind of philosophy. So Zach, I thought that we would do a little icebreaker
Sounds good.
question, something a little lighthearted. Yeah, just to get people to know you. All right. So I have the question here.
All
So are
right.
you ready? All
I'm
right.
ready.
What do you think happens when we die?
What do I think happens when we die? My gut instinct on this one, and just from my studies, would be that we reincarnate in some way. So, it's the basic idea that what you do here matters, and it sort of sets the tone for what happens in the next life. So I believe there's continuance. What it looks like, it's hard to say.
Okay, well, I have a second bonus question. Do you think there are pets in heaven? And please speak clearly so all the pet owners out there can hear you.
Oh yeah, it's a very
So
important
this,
question.
this shouldn't.
Yeah, so my gut thought as well with animals and whatnot sort of relates to the reincarnation thing, because I think that what type of consciousness animals have is not really for me to say, but I suspect that they have a form of consciousness, and so I would suspect that they also reincarnate. So I would think that our relationships with animals do matter, and I don't think we're quite like ready as a culture to really understand that. But I think at some point, once we get human interactions figured out, we'll start to get even better with animals. And I know there are people already doing work with that. But yeah, I think our relationships with animals matter.
Well, in the relationship of full disclosure, I was just trying to be funny, but I can tell that you actually thought about that.
I actually
So,
have some serious answers for these things. My wife hates that sometimes. She'll try to joke with me. I'm just like, I just go all existential on her.
well, let's go for the trifecta. Okay.
There we go. Let's go
What
for it,
is
man.
your deepest darkest secret?
Deepest, darkest secret. Oh my gosh.
No, I'm
Hmm.
just joking. So
Yeah.
well think about it. If you want to share it at the end of the program,
Okay. Sounds
that'll
good.
be
Sounds good. I will kick that around in my brain and see what I can dig up. So.
awesome. Okay, so moving to the actual topic of the episode. So I'll have to admit, when you first brought up this idea of non-attachment, my mind immediately rejected it.
Hmm.
I think for a number of reasons, because I had this association with non-attachment made it seem like not caring, but that's not really the case at all. So maybe the first question would be, let's say you're talking to someone who has only like rudimentary English skills. So you have to be careful with the way you explain non-attachment.
Yeah.
So say in that scenario, how would you actually go about it?
Hmm. Well, I like the idea of, you know, in the Bible, Jesus spoke in parables. And I think that that's a very good way of explaining things by analogy, because it sort of breaks things down in language that we can all relate to in some way. So usually trying to find some sort of analogy. And I think the way that I would explain it is, if you've ever been in a relationship, um, there's this, when you're close with somebody, whether it's a friend or family member, or somebody who you're in a romantic relationship with, um, there's a level to which a person can come across needy, and I've been very guilty of this in my life, very guilty. And then there's also elements of a friendship or relationship where people want the best for you, but they don't have to put expectations on you. So the idea is to show love to a person that's not affected by non-attachment. But what is affected and what is changed in the dynamic is that with non-attachment, you seek to love a person or love a situation or love life without placing expectations on it. You take responsibility for your own emotions and your own thoughts and your own feelings as something that you have to work on independent of the situations and the other people. So that's my idea of non-attachment, and I think it jives very well with intimate relationships as well, because it's the opposite to codependency.
Okay, yeah, I actually think that's a really good the way you put it. I'm preparing for this topic. I actually kind of thought of analogy, and you can really use this with anything. But like, I don't know, say you have a candy bar or something like that, right? Candy bar is good, obviously. And what I think happens with people that have attachment problems, which I admittedly have for most of my life, and only recently started practicing on attachment. But
Mm.
so let's say you're holding the candy bar in your hand. You like you're more likely to grip it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because you're afraid of losing it. But the paradox in that is, yeah, you might not lose it, you might keep it, but are you really going to enjoy it? Can you
Mm.
really enjoy this thing when you're holding on so tight to it? And the kind of paradox of it is if you loosen your grip and you let go, not only can you enjoy what you have, but you can let go of things and you can also receive things. It's like having a posture to life that's more open.
Yeah.
And instead of viewing uncertainty um, with anxiety, you can actually start to view uncertainty with excitement because
Mm.
there's an exponential thing, like amount of things that can happen in your life. Um, and I think a lot of what attachment boils down to is this false sense of control that we often have. Now we do have control of things, but most of those are within ourselves. They're internal. And even then, I think it's a little bit sticky because even within ourselves, we there's a lot that we don't control. There's the subconscious. You know, you try to find healthy ways to let those vent, but ultimately, even ourselves, we're not in fully in control over. So I think, yeah, the problem with attachment is it almost sets you up for perpetual disappointment because you have this narrative in your mind of how things are supposed to go, and when they don't meet your expectations, you wind up getting hurt from it. But the thing is, this is another analogy I thought of. So let's say you like milk and you also like orange juice. You pick up a glass, you can't see what's in it. You're expecting orange juice, but instead you drink milk. Well, you love milk, but in that moment you're disgusted because you didn't get what you expected. So you're with your expectations, you robbed yourself of the enjoyment that you could have had.
Yeah. I think.
I'm passing it back to you.
Yeah. I think you summed up a lot of elements to it, and I like your analogy of holding the candy bar because it's this idea that with life, there's that saying, the only constant is change.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really true. And I don't know if you've had this experience, I suspect you have, but my experience with pleasure and getting like things that I wanted, the fulfillment of desires, is that they're not as satisfactory as we want to think that they are. That so much of the satisfaction is sort of wrapped up in our expectations and our ideas and sort of this place that we go to in our minds of like this fantasy of like if X and X, happen, if X, Y, and Z happen, then I will all of a sudden be launched into happiness, be launched into
Mm.
bliss. And so in our minds, we sort of have a feeling of like what that feels like. And we have that feeling because we remember like when we were kids, or there were times in our life where we really did touch that. Maybe, when we were doing something that we really loved, we have these memories, or when we've really loved the person deeply or been loved deeply. And that memory keeps reminding us that that's out there, but we don't know how to get there. So what we do is we have expectations that we place upon life, and we say, if these expectations are met, then I will reach that place of happiness that I remember so clearly in my brain that happened before, and we've associated it with all the conditions that led up to that. But it's a lot more subtle because life doesn't just conform to our desires. And like what you were saying about control, it ties in very much with that, with being adaptable, being willing to flow with life. And in order to do that, you can't be gripping on super tightly. And like you said, with control, there are a lot of ancient teachings with this, which I won't go into, but I would direct anybody who's interested in further study into Stoicism and Buddhism as a good comparison on this basic idea. But it's a pretty universal thing in all the different religions and philosophies, is that if you study happiness deeply and desire deeply, you start to realize that you're kind of on a loop. In psychology, they talk about it as habituation. So there's a lot of parallels. But yeah, it's that basic idea. You hold on too tight and you're going to miss the good things in life.
I had a thought, and then you said something else, and then now it's escaping from me, which is making me feel disappointed.
Because you had an expectation.
I really was attached to sharing that thought. That's kind of ironic because I had an idea, a script in my head of the way this interview was going to go. And
yeah.
So far, it has not turned out that way. Here, talk about something else, and maybe it'll come back to me.
Yeah. So, just riffing on this whole idea, because I mean, it's funny how I've noticed that you can take and you can enter into sort of this deeper layer of human psychology through so many different entry points. And non-attachment is one of those entry points. You start talking about it, and then you can link it with so many other aspects of the same basic sense of like psychological health. And we're starting to get to a place as a culture where we are starting to recognize that we have to start working with our minds now, because we've gotten material success and it hasn't made us happy on the whole. Like we're just not really as happy of a culture as we should be. But we also have to let go of those judgments, because those judgments are based on misunderstandings of human psychology. We've thought that if we get more, that we will be happier. If we have more security, we'll be happier. But what we find actually is that sometimes having difficulties in our life, and even, dare I say, having tragedy sometimes in our life, actually does open up deeper layers of our psychology and of our emotions that we don't tap into when everything is safe, when everything is predictable, and when things are going our way. So actually having our roots and our foundation shaken now and then is, in the long run, a positive if we take responsibility for our own thoughts, emotions, and actions. If we do that, then we can respond to these situations with equanimity. We can say, whatever situation arises, I can work with it. Not to blame ourselves, or put all the weight on us to feel good. It's more just saying the only area that I can reasonably influence would be my inner attitude towards things. That's the closest thing. Like you alluded to, even that is very elusive, but that's a whole other discussion for another time, is that deeper layer. But for the most part, like, we can work with our attitudes.
Yeah, I think one of the things that helped me kind of accept the kind of theory as valid is, just realizing that just because, say, you're able to practice non-attachment, it doesn't mean that you don't have goals. It doesn't mean that you don't care about people. It doesn't mean you don't have hopes and dreams, but you carry them in such a way that you're not going to be devastated if things don't go by your narrative. And that's how really people think. They think in narrative. Like, let's say even something good, like you're recounting good, it's something that's happened in your life, like you're married, right? So when you tell the story of you and your wife, it really is a narrative. And
Absolutely.
the way that we tell narratives, it's not entirely accurate. It's how we remember them. But you may do something like combine two separate like events into one, but nobody would like accuse you of lying or anything like that. But it's just the way we think. And I think the struggle for a lot of us is our future narratives not lining up with like what it has actually unfolded. Um, but for the sake of time and just moving this along, let's kind of hit like the more practical aspects of non-attachment. I'd like you to share first. I have my own experiences with it, but I wanted you to start first.
Mhm.
How has it practically helped you in your life? And feel free to give some examples.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question, because ultimately, if we don't make teachings practical, then they aren't of that much use. So the practical teachings are always the most important when it comes to
Mm.
philosophy, religion, anything. You want to practice what you preach. So there's two parts of the practical side of non-attachment. The one is cultivating, where you start to cultivate the sense of non-attachment first, because in order to practice it, you have to sense it within yourself. And so the first part is the inner practice, and then the second part is sort of the outward extension of it, the fruit, so to speak, of the seeds that you plant through the inner practice. Um, and there are many, as I alluded to, there are two traditions that are really good at that, which I would refer people to if they want to study deeper, which would be Stoicism and Buddhism, have a lot of good practices, but I could break down the basic ideas. The basic ideas of what you could practice is, one is meditation, because meditation allows us to sit and to detach from our thoughts, our narratives, our goals, our sense of doing. We just sit there and we push ourselves to just sit and to let the thoughts come and go, let the emotions come and go, and not attach to them with our attention. You start to cultivate that sort of looseness of attention, where you're in control of where your mind wanders. You can see the thoughts and the feelings when they come, but you let them come in and you let them go. That's a model for how we can live our lives with non-attachment, is we let things come in, we let them go. And we don't try to hold on to those things. So that would be the first thing, would be meditation in that sort of way. It's called mindfulness meditation, if anyone wants to look into it. The second one would be something more in line with, say, Stoicism. They taught some really good techniques of this. And basically, the whole idea of, in your mind, you can visualize scenarios that go against your expectations. So if you expect, say, like with this interview, if we expect it to go a certain way, we could, before we do the interview, or just when you're doing some contemplation, you could allow yourself very intentionally to visualize ways that the interview could go that would not be according to what you wanted. Just visualize it, not in the sense of you wanting to quote unquote manifest it or anything. It's intentionally letting yourself contemplate what that would feel like in your body and in your mind, and to sit with it. Just be like, how would this feel if it went opposite to the way I want it to be? And the same thing can be done with visualizations of death, like thinking about what would happen if I got diagnosed with a terminal illness. How would that change my life? How would I feel with that? And you just do a little trip inside and like really try to hone in on those emotions and how it would recalibrate your life. That's maybe the best way of practicing non-attachment, because that's the possibility of losing everything. And if you really sort of dive into that feeling intentionally, where you have some stability, that it's just a visualization exercise, you'll be better equipped for when actual real traumatic events happen. So those would be my two main recommendations, would be meditation and visualization.
In the short time, I think it's been like perhaps like a month and a half where I've actively have started practicing it. And for those who haven't yet, It really is a practice. Like you have to practice or it goes away.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't know, just like a real like example, like recently, something that's everybody is dealing with like the quarantine and like the uncertainty. Um, so I know for myself at my job, we didn't know if we were going to get shut down or not. And I was able to like actually remain calm because I thought to myself of all the times in my life where I did not know how things were going to work out, how I was going to get taken care of, how my loved ones were going to be taken care of. But you know, if sometimes if you can take the 5,000 foot view, you can see how things were just kind of laid before you, and they kind of unfolded as you went along. And then you can remember all the time and energy you spent like racking your brain worrying about how things were going to get taken care of, that in large part to this day you don't even know how that happened. And I think that you can take that view even if, like, say you're not spiritual, say you're agnostic or atheist, you know, um, things do kind of play themselves out. So I think it's, in a lot of ways, it almost seems like emotional and mental jujitsu. It's like you're taking the energy of life and kind of like redirecting it to kind of use it to your advantage. So like something I said before, like when I'm at my best at practicing it, I do have like just kind of inner peace, and I kind of have this enjoyment of how like life unfolds like before me. You know, the things that are rather unpleasant, they don't get to me so much. And the things that I currently have, like just beautiful weather for my children, I can actually like enjoy them, and I can have peace when the world's like completely upside down. Now, that's not to say there isn't things or emotions or situations that come along that don't knock me off my horse, so to speak, but um, it has proven in my life to like take my anxiety away. And believe me when I tell you, my life has been almost entirely riddled with anxiety.
Yeah.
I have really huge problems with attachment, and I do want to control things. But yeah, letting go of the thought of control is the most liberating thing that you can do. It's actually like kind of the path to freedom. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, you when you said the word freedom, it triggered something for me because at the very beginning when you first did the intro to this discussion, that was the word that came to mind was freedom. That basically non-attachment is an exercise in absolute freedom, because freedom is often misunderstood as freedom to fulfill our desires. But the entire um, the entire cycle of having desires and then chasing them down and then trying to subdue life, you know, you, it's basically a hunting analogy. You know, you're imagining that thing out there, and I've got to go and use force and violence to subdue this desire that I've just crafted in my brain and make it happen. You know, and not to say that that's not a legitimate part of existence, it is. But in cultivating inner peace, when you're at that place where you need the peace, you need the joy and all that, it becomes more helpful to start to ask, what would it really look like for me to be free, and what does freedom actually look like in this life? Because rather
Mm,
than taking the view that freedom is the freedom to pursue whatever desires I want, or the freedom to have those desires fulfilled, the freedom to have all the material comforts, to have everything going my way, that's one ideal sort of freedom that we have, or
mhm,
freedom from outside coercion. That's one theory of freedom, but I would say that there's a deeper level to freedom that lines up more with psychology, more with what we know about human nature. And it is universal, like you said. You can apply it if you're religious, spiritual, if you're agnostic or atheist. It is a universal language that can sort of add richness to whatever experience you're having, which is the idea that whatever your circumstances are, and even down to whatever thoughts are playing in your mind or whatever feelings you're having, you can keep pushing that back a little bit as you gain awareness and start to notice those things. Whenever anything agitates you and disturbs your inner peace, there's a level where you can just be like, what's really disturbing my inner peace is that I'm not accepting this right now. Is that I'm
Mm.
holding on to an idea that I have in my head of how this moment should be, and that's not what's happening right now. So by developing and cultivating non-attachment, we can choose to be more accepting and more open with our approach to life, letting life come in, letting life do, what it's going to do, because it's going to happen. Like, that's indisputable. The life does what it wants to do, and for the most part, it's
Yeah.
not according to exactly what we want. But over time, too, as you start to become more intentional about your attention and your energy, things can start to line up in a way that agrees a little bit more with you. So it's a double-edged sword. It's not, like you said, it's not complete relinquishment of goals and action in life, but it's a sense of, like you said, jujitsu. Like, you're going to work with whatever happens and turn negatives into positives.
Well, before we close, I actually had a thought of, this practice definitely falls under the easier said than done thing.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So I was thinking about, what would non-attachment look like in a tragedy, like a passing away of a loved one, right?
Yeah.
We associate non-attachment with freedom, but so I've had a loved one pass away before,
Yeah.
and I remember feeling a little bit confined and not being able to properly mourn and different things like that.
Yeah.
So let's say you do have a loved one passed away. Like, I think non-attachment can help you in the sense that you give yourself the freedom to mourn,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And that way you're actually releasing things. Because what happens a lot of the time is, like, people are conditioned to not, like, express their feelings, or their feelings are not valid. So maybe the non-attachment part would be letting go of that notion that, like, you can't show your emotions or you can't mourn. I mean,
Yeah.
it really isn't about not caring or not loving, but yeah, like you said, the jujitsu, using what life gives you. Well, life gave you a tragedy, and you need to properly, like, express that. You need to properly mourn things, um, to be free. It's like the dark path to freedom at that point in your life, but it's still like a path to freedom. And you don't have to stay in the tragedy, so to speak. Maybe that's the kind of the dark side, but still like a valid, like, application of non-attachment and what that kind of actually looks like. Because the person that passed away was my mother, and I don't think I properly mourned her for years and years and years. Didn't really talk about her that much. So, but who knows what it would have been like. But part of why I'm making this series is because, like, I know there's so much I didn't know in my life, like things I wasn't taught. And maybe if I was built differently, if I wasn't hyper curious, or someone didn't come along in my life to share some of these things, then, like, I would be, like, completely in the dark about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've talked to people about this before, like, something, this is a different topic, but like toxic behavior, right? You spend a good portion of your life in school, which is a large part of toxic environment, and you're never really, unless by your parents, you're not told about toxic behavior, so you think it's normal. And then what happens? You wind up subjecting yourself to abuse because this is how the way people act when it's not okay at all. But that's another topic. But so, do you have any closing thoughts before we
Yeah,
end
I
this?
do. Yeah, because I wanted to just add a little bit to what you said, and and sort of just close out that way, I think, just sort of to reiterate and reinforce what you already said, because it was very, very on point. And because the first thing that you brought up was just like grief as a really good example, because I think it's maybe emotions are misunderstood when it comes to non-attachment. And I think that was your initial gut reaction, is that a part of you was saying, oh, is non-attachment, that sounds like detachment, that sounds like being emotionally aloof. and I'll be honest, like sometimes it looks like that, because there's a sense that we can think of everything in terms of energy. That's one way, one lens that we can look at life. And so when we look at our attention and our investments of attention, what are we investing our attention in? Are we investing our attention in cultivating inner peace and tranquility and inner strength, or are we putting our attention on the way that we want life to play out and those narratives, and creating the circumstances for those narratives to be fulfilled? Because one way will lead to long-term gains, long-term growth, and long-term emotional and mental stability, but it's a long path. It's a very intentional path, and it's a lifelong path for many people. I think that when people start to figure this certain thing out, it ends up being the main focus of the rest of their lives. Usually, is how do I practice this? Because there's so many levels to it. And when it comes to emotions and grief and worldly attachments, like there's this aspect of life that we call love. And it is the most amazing aspect of life, and it requires emotional engagement. That's the real lesson. You have to be emotionally engaged. So there's a level of attachment that can come with that. And some teachings of non-attachment will teach people to sort of disconnect from everyone and everything. You have the idea of a monk in a cave somewhere, practicing yoga for the rest of his life or whatever, And I think that path can be valid for some people, depending on what your circumstances are, what your goals are in life. But there's also the way to be present in your life emotionally, to have a level of engagement with life where I hesitate to say be attached, because I do think that there's a way to be emotionally present, but not be overly attached. And it's something that like it's always going, if we're emotionally involved, it's going to hurt sometimes. Like that's a given. And like you said, the freedom to allow yourself to mourn, if that's what needs to come up, it's sort of like a permission. Your non-attachment also extends to your expectations of yourself. And that's maybe the holy grail of non-attachment, is being non-attached towards yourself, and how your body, your emotions, and your mind operates. Because ultimately, if we try to just power through those emotions and stuff them down, which I've done most of my life. I've only, in recent years been working to recover my emotions. If we constantly push those things down, it won't lead to healthy, fulfilling life. It won't lead to connection with other people. So if we've heard about Stoicism or some of these, more, or like Buddhism or some of these non-attachment sort of based traditions, we may have ideas about somebody who's emotionally aloof, but that's a shadow side of the practice. If you go too far that way, you could end up being that way. But some people also need a little bit of isolation for a time. I don't think that it's unreasonable to expect a person to go a little too far on this path in terms of finding balance. So if you go a little bit too far and find yourself emotionally and mentally aloof from life, that's perfectly normal. Just note it and then try to get back in the game of emotionally without the expectations, and that's the art. So I'll end with that.
Yeah, it seems like the aloofness is, they have a word for that, autopilot.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, I've been in. Like I think when we first started, I also got the kind of the vision of what they call highway hypnosis. Which you can go through life like that, and it does feel like nothing can hurt you, but nothing is nourishing to you either. So, like with anything, life is about balance. But I guess my closing thoughts would be, I'm actually optimistic about the future currently, because I don't nothing in our world has happened like this, I don't think, in recent history. This level of people being forced to stop, and our distractions that we usually have in our day-to-day lives don't seem to be enough anymore. But I think it's a good thing, because I think it's causing a lot of people to go inward. So what I'm hoping for, and maybe, you know, anybody hears this, or, you know, comes across non-attachment, you know, in a different place, well, more than likely they will. Um, I have a feeling the world's not going to be the same ever again, and I hope this time prepares people for it. That's what I'm trying to do currently.
Hmm.
I don't mean to sound hyperbolic, but I mean, you can ask anybody, what other year have you experienced has been like 2020? I mean, it's like almost each month is epoch. It's
Yep.
like insane.
Hmm.
And so, but those are my closing thoughts. But Zach, thank you so much for
Thank
not
you
only
as
being
well.
on the show, but actually bringing it together to we actually can get this recorded. But we'll
Absolutely.
definitely do some more interviews in the future when we come up with some more interesting topics. But
My pleasure.
thank you so
Absolutely.
much.
Anytime.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Peace out.